Welcome to Taiwan Talks, covering the latest global news from a Taiwan perspective. I'm Leslie Liao. The visit of former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger to China, whom Xi Jinping referred to as an old friend, raises questions about the future trajectory of U.S. China relations. Furthermore, in a recent interview, former U.S. President Donald Trump made unexpected claims, stating that Taiwan had taken away America's semiconductor business, while he also alluded to a close relationship with Xi Jinping. What do these statements mean for the future stability of the Indo-Pacific? Well, not just the Indo-Pacific, but for Taiwan-U.S. relations, U.S.-China relations, and Taiwan-China relations. Luckily for me, I have a very talented panel of guests joining me today. First, we have Ambassador Leonard Chao, Adjunct Professor at the National Tsinghua University, Chair of the Taiwan People's Party Committee on Mainland China Affairs, and former Taiwan Ambassador to the Kingdom of Eswatini. Next, we have Wen-Ti Sung, non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council Global China Hub, sessional lecturer at Australian National University. And the third person on our panel is Professor Chen Ping-kuei, associate professor at National Tsing University's Department of Diplomacy and executive director of the university's Executive Master Program in Strategy and International Affairs. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me. Let's talk. So Henry Kissinger, he's 100 years old, and he's made a surprise visit to Beijing, the first since 2019. What's interesting is he was the U.S. Secretary of State back in 1977, and the last maybe prominent government role he held was being the chair of the 9/11 committee, which obviously examined the September 11th attacks in the United States, and that was only a 2-week tenure. My question is, how relevant is his visit, and what is he trying to achieve? Ambassador Chao, as the top diplomat and closest ranking to Henry Kissinger, can we get your perspective first?
Well, first of all, I happened to run into Dr. Kissinger himself, in the Republican National Convention many years ago when I was in Washington. And whenever we talk about the U.S. China relations, Kissinger is a must. It's the name of the must. He's a well-known, consummate diplomat, as well as the geopolitical strategist. He's kind of a legendary character, the pathfinder from the United States to open the door to China, and also paving the foundation for the future development of the U.S.-China relations. Of course, this time, although Kissinger himself, he's not holding any substantial position in the government. He's a legend. He has some symbolic meaning. Himself, he's a symbolic meaning. Already, the background for his visit this time around. Happy birthday, this old man. In addition to the political scenario, as you know that although Jake Sullivan, he claims that he doesn't represent the United States government for this visit to China, but Tony Blinken, he claims that in public he has been in close contact with Kissinger, and after Kissinger's visit to China, on the way, in return, he's going to meet with Kissinger. So undoubtedly, there's some diplomatic and political background and incentives for this visit. However, I'd like to emphasize that's another reason: business. I think on almost the same day, upon Kissinger's landing in China, Tony Blinken in Washington, he met with several U.S. business leaders, including Intel, Qualcomm, and NVIDIA. Those people, they are representing the business interests because they're trying to, if I may use the word, lobby Blinken to work on the recent restriction policy on the chips import from China. Definitely, that will be detrimental to their respective business. So I think, in a word, Kissinger, this time, he represents the history of the U.S.-China relation, also the political reason, and also some business interests. That's a combined, background for his visit.
Professor Chen, I'd like to pose this question to you. The ambassador said that Kissinger is a legendary figure when it comes to diplomatic relations, and that can be backed up by his Nobel Prize for brokering peace during the Vietnam War. In your opinion, does Kissinger's legacy kind of permeate his current status? Does he still hold sway in the ways and to help navigate something as complicated as the triangle that is Taiwan-China-U.S. relations?
There's no doubt that Kissinger is a significant figure in Washington think tanks. He represents that there is a chance for bridging with China. So his visit this time is a first. For a long time, there are some heavyweight scholars or policymakers who visit China and become welcomed by China. Now, why this is significant? Because there is a long period of time where China and the United States did not have a lot of engagement with each other. So Kissinger actually represents some kind of voices in Washington, D.C. that hopes China and U.S. will restart the engagement. And we cannot say that this engagement will necessarily lead to cooperation or peace, but it at least open up a chance for dialogue. There are many scholars and think tankers who advocate this kind of measures. And we have to understand, I think Ambassador Zhao pointed out very correctly, there is some business interest in this trip too. We have to understand that Kissinger himself has a consultant firm, Kissinger Associate, has been established for 40 years after he retired from government. So he has been doing a lot of consulting jobs for U.S. companies to bridge up between U.S. and China. And this trip shows that Kissinger still has the ability to bridge between U.S. and China.
And over the past month, it's not just Kissinger, but we've also seen high-profile visits to the U.S. from China. You have Treasury Secretary Yellen, you have, as both mentioned before, you have current Secretary of State Antony Blinken, and you also have the Biden climate envoy John Kerry. I will say myself, I think they were not received as warmly as perhaps with Kissinger. Now, Wen-Ti, I would like you to weigh in on this really quickly. Do you think that why do you think China is a little more receptive to a 100-year-old former diplomat, whereas people who are in the current administration didn't seem to get much of a reaction out of Xi's people?
Well, this is how Beijing shows discriminate treatment of different kind of people. I suppose on one hand, you have people who China sees as their competitors, and the other camp would be people who China sees as their quote-unquote old friends. Kissinger obviously fall under the latter camp, the old friends camp. And I think for China, the only way they can entice more foreign actors into trying to befriend Beijing, trying to act and talk in ways that would change prevailing public opinion in the West in a way that will be more Beijing friendly, is for China to give its quote-unquote old friends extra nicer treatment. That's how you change the incentive structure facing Western opinion leaders. So in this sense, it's no different. And I think from Biden administration perspective, it's only part of a new normal in a sense for American leading officials to be receiving at best lukewarm treatment in Beijing, given that we are certainly in the new era of more intense U.S. China strategic competition.
Ambassador, can I throw that same question to you? Why is it that a country would be more inclined to speak to someone who, vast influence, but not as much with the direct channels to make change, whereas you have three right there who are coming to you and saying, hello, we would like to obviously try and warm relations again?
Well, I have to point out that if you look at deeper the political philosophy of China, that this is a country of focusing on the formality politics, formality, symbolism. That's what they're focusing on. Well, these four figures we're talking about, Kissinger and Yellen and Blinken and Kerry, well, they represent the different kind of backgrounds and different kind of meanings, different kind of symbolism to the Chinese leaders, to Chinese people. First, Kissinger represent very little, nothing but positive impact, because he's the one who bridged, what the gentleman mentioned earlier, that the two countries together in the first place. So, and the other three figures, although they are the incumbent government officials of Biden administration, they are simply for some technical matters, respective technical matters. One for foreign policy, Well, among the three persons, if I may venture to comment that Blinken is probably one of the least respectable figure from the Chinese perspective, because he represents, everybody knows his visit, his original visit in early this year has been postponed because of the spy balloon incident. So although I think that China reluctantly kind of like to receive Blinken, so he's been received, his audience with Xi Jinping has been a matter of flattery, okay? But among the three, I would like to say John Kerry is one of the most welcome figures, because Kerry is probably the most frequent visitors from the Biden administration, okay, for visiting China climate, which is non-political. So China has always welcomed Kerry's visit, no matter how frequent that is. And Yellen, well, he is kind of a between, somewhere in between. His original verse about the confrontation with China has been well known, but in the recent days, it's kind of toned down, at the animosity toward China, which has been appreciated, by Chinese leaders. And this time, as you know that, although heavily criticized by the American audience, the moment Yellen met with the new Prime Minister Li Qiang, he was bowing, many times, but that somehow softened the Chinese original, the negative feeling about the U.S. figures. So I think these four people, they represent different meaning. Definitely, China will receive them in a different kind of gesture.
So diplomacy, even though we're talking about exchanges on a countrywide level, personability and past exchanges are still very important, even on a person-to-person level.
I think they can hardly unify, universal, standard of the receiving or the protocol, ceremony. So I think definitely there's some difference.
Wen-Ti, I see. Would you like to add something?
Yeah, I think judging from the way that China treats these four American figures, it sort of tells you where China sees the window of opening may be in terms of improving relations with the U.S. So Henry Kissinger definitely represents the more non-government part of U.S. society, where China sees a lot of room for opening, so he gets great treatment. John Kerry represents climate change, i.e. an area of global public goods or area of common interest on which a Democratic administration is relatively amenable to persuasion on, so he gets second best treatment. Then economy, Yellen, of course, and finally get to Blinken, Secretary of State, who represent high politics, which is the thorniest, the most sensitive part of U.S.-China relations, and hence he got a cold shoulder.
Professor Chen, I saw you nod your head when Wen-Ti said that this gives you the idea of the priorities where China can reopen relations with the U.S. Do you agree with that, and where do you think these opportunities lie?
Yeah, I totally agree with him. So basically, it depends on how difficult the issues are. Basically, Tony Blinken went there to talk about the toughest issue between U.S. and China. And if you look at Kerry's case, climate change not only has been the most likely places where China and U.S. can cooperate, it has been something that China has been trying to cooperate. So obviously, China will give Kerry a higher respect. As for Kissinger, I would say that even he doesn't represent government, he represents some voice in Washington, and China is looking at this voice and hope that this voice can take over in the current administrative sphere of Washington.
Let's move on to our next topic. Based on the recent state of U.S.-China relations, what challenges will Taiwan face? Former U.S. President Donald Trump recently alleged that Taiwan has been stealing semiconductor jobs, and during a media interview with Maria Bartiromo told journalists that if China takes over Taiwan, China could take over the world. Now, let's take a look at this very quickly, because U.S. President Donald Trump, he used to be perceived as very tough on China and Taiwan friendly, but we're also in a very sensitive time. We're also in a very complicated time. We have Taiwan's elections coming up. We have the U.S.'s elections coming up. So we see this very interesting shift. Are Trump's words him trying to extend an olive branch, and is it an attempt to undermine the Biden administration? Because in my opinion, as someone who's lived in the U.S., that if you're a Democrat, if the Republicans go right, you go left, and vice versa. Professor Chen, could you shine some light on this? Why did Trump suddenly make this kind of a U-turn in what he's saying?
First of all, I don't think Trump is very friendly to Taiwan, not even when he was president. It was the people he signed up for who are friendly to Taiwan. So Trump himself, I really doubt that he understands the whole situation in Taiwan Strait and the idea of how U.S. can maintain the triangle relationship. I think Trump would do anything to undermine Biden administration. So he would deny everything Biden administration is trying to do. So he would even try to say he can manage China better than Biden does. So that's something he always tried to do, and he did these things, say these words for winning the election, and unfortunately, it sometimes work.
Wen-Ti, back to you. What do you think what is President Trump trying to communicate to Beijing? Is he trying to communicate to Beijing, or is he trying to communicate to the American voters? I think there's a difference. What do you think?
So I think rather than saying whether Trump is trying to undermine Biden administration, I think I'd rather say this is Trump's attempt at doing product differentiation, if you will. And more broadly speaking, of course, I mean, Trump has an election campaign he's trying to enter. He also has a number of potential legal troubles that he's trying to manage. So at a moment like that, it's natural that he will want to find ways to improve perceived gravitas on his part, as well as perceived indispensability of himself personally. And so, for example, not just on Taiwan, but Trump also said, for example, last year that if he was still the president of the U.S., then Ukraine war wouldn't have happened because Putin would have dared to invade. So things like that, that's sort of how Trump rolls. And really, even when he was in power, he still had a very transactionalist approach to diplomacy, whereby he liked to keep up a certain maximum pressure campaign. He liked to say, rather than giving any of my friends, allies, and partners a blank check, he would say, I will keep you in suspense. So in that sense, it's definitely driving up perceived price of American assistance if he were president. But at the same time, of course, it's also not quite out of the bounds of traditional posture of strategic ambiguity. So he gets to have it both ways.
And no longer really analyze what he said about the semiconductors. Here's a question about the 2024 election. Now, as we pointed out, Biden has seemed to be since he took the presidency, he seems to be going from strategic ambiguity to more strategic clarity. On 4 accounts, he said he'd come to Taiwan's defense. Now, to me, that's a very pro-Taiwan stance. At the same time, you have Trump, who's the front runner. He's taking this new direction where he's saying Taiwan may be not so good, taking our semiconductor business. He's a front runner for the Republican Party, which is a little bit in disarray right now. And I chalk this up to maybe the Republican and the Democratic divide. But with how much influence that Trump has, do we think that he's going to take the Republican Party in a different direction? Will there be a policy shift in the Republican Party regarding Taiwan? Professor Chen, if I can get your opinion.
Well, my own observation is that Republican Party members know who Trump is and what he would do. And I don't think they are likely to follow Trump once again, unless he really has a very good chance to win. At least right now, we see there are several candidates whose polls are leading. Trump is one of them. DeSantis is another. It is still too early to say who is going to become the presidential candidate. But I think within GOP there is a discussion or doubt on whether Trump will be our finest leader in this election.
Wen-Ti, can I get your opinion on that? Is Trump leading a new shift in U.S. China policy with his words, no matter what they may be, or no matter what kind of intentions may be behind them?
I think it's a little bit too early to say, given that GOP primary process hasn't even really officially started yet. What I can say is that China policy, including U.S. acting a lot more assertively on China, has been the closest thing to a bipartisan consensus in U.S. politics over the last couple of years. And really, I find it hard to imagine a situation in which leading presidential hopeful from both sides will seek to compete on how soft they can be on China, as opposed to how assertive rather they are on China. So in that sense, I think Trump's rhetoric may attract significant media interest, But when it comes to serious campaigning time, what we're likely to see is candidates competing to see how they can best effectively and assertively manage China threat in a way that stands up for American values and American pride.
Ambassador, how historically, how much of a foreign policy shift can we expect from a presidential candidate of that caliber?
When we keep talking about policy this and policy that, I would like to venture to point out the catching difference between. He is not, Trump. He's hardly a policy maker. He's rather a deal maker. From a business background, he's rather a deal maker. Instead of a seriously a policy maker. But he will change. He keep changing his stance on China or on Taiwan, as we remember vividly that in the early days of his presidency, even before he became the president, after his election, he made a phone call to Tsai Ing-wen, a phone call that caused some a row and a controversy. But later on, recently he was interviewed. He was asked by the media whether he's going to come to the rescue of Taiwan in case of any military conflict in the Taiwan Strait area. He kept silent. So his policy, he doesn't have, this gentleman hardly has any concrete or respectable or foreseeable certain policy per se. He's rather a deal maker.
I see. Can we just go back really quickly, because Taiwan is in the headlines quite a bit these days, internationally as well, and it's coinciding with a lot of events. Not to say Taiwan's own election, because we live in Taiwan, we're it every day, but this is also kind of a fulcrum point for American policy as well. How impactful, how significant do you see Taiwan as an issue, or rather U.S. China policy, in the U.S. election, in the upcoming U.S. election? Professor, maybe start off with you.
Okay, as far as I understand, foreign policy is never the main focus of the U.S. presidential re-election. So voters usually do not care about foreign policy. I would agree that voters would pay some attention to the U.S.-China rivalry because it affects their lives. It is almost like during the Cold War, when U.S. had a communist enemy over there. So that may have some effect. In D.C., just like the gentleman just said, there is a strong atmosphere against China. So parties will only compete each other with how hardened they are against China instead of how softened they are. So as a result, I think we will see very similar foreign policy initiative from both parties, whereas the election will be decided somewhere else in other issues.
Thank you so much. We've talked about so much. We may have talked about the Henry Kissinger trip. We're talking about American politics, but at the same time, we realized that all of these things are intertwined in a time of not chaos, but uncertainty, diplomatic uncertainty. Not just diplomatic uncertainty, but domestic uncertainty, not just in Taiwan, maybe in the U.S. We didn't quite focus about that much in China, but one thing is clear, I think, gentlemen, all three sides are intertwined to a certain degree, whether it's politically, economically, diplomatically. In this episode, we analyzed the recent high-level meetings between U.S. and Chinese officials, Kissinger's meeting with Xi Jinping, and Trump's attitude towards Taiwan. We hope you enjoyed our show. Feel free to leave a comment and remember to subscribe. Until next time, take care.